My name is Samantha, and I am 33 years old. 10 years ago, my mother threw my Harvard acceptance letter into a paper shredder, just so my golden child brother would not feel inferior. I only found out the truth last Saturday while sitting at the head table of his $150,000 wedding. When the secret finally spilled out in front of everyone, my mother did not apologize. She did not look away in shame. Instead, she took a slow sip of her champagne, smiled right at me, and whispered that I would not have lasted a single semester anyway. What she did not realize was that I had not come to this extravagant wedding to celebrate. I had come to collect a very old debt. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after your family tried to tear you down. The ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel was dripping in luxury. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, and crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the 300 guests. It was the kind of wedding that belonged in a high society magazine. My brother Jason was 30 years old and playing the role of the wildly successful tech entrepreneur to absolute perfection. Beside him sat his beautiful new bride, Kendra. Kendra is a brilliant black woman who worked her way through medical school to become a top-tier anesthesiologist. She looked absolutely stunning in her custom silk gown, her radiant dark skin glowing against the pristine white fabric. She was smart-driven and independent. For the life of me, I could not understand how my brother had managed to fool a woman of her caliber. But Jason had always been an expert at selling an illusion heavily funded by our mother Brenda. I was seated at the far edge of the head table, placed there merely for the sake of appearances. My mother Brenda sat right beside Jason, beaming with pride in her incredibly expensive designer dress. She lived for these moments of public validation. To her country club friends, she was the perfect matriarch who had raised a boy genius. I was just the quiet daughter who worked in finance. As the dinner service concluded, the clinking of crystal glasses signaled the start of the speeches. That was when my Uncle Rick stumbled up to the microphone. Uncle Rick was my mother's older brother, and he was already 4 martinis deep. He had a bitter streak and an undeniable resentment toward my mother's constant bragging. He tapped the microphone, sending a harsh feedback screech echoing through the massive ballroom. He swayed slightly, gripping the mic stand for balance. To Jason, the golden boy. Uncle Rick slurred his voice, booming through the speakers. He raised his glass, spilling a little liquor on the polished wood floor. "You really pulled it off, kid." And to Samantha. He suddenly pointed a shaky finger directly at me. The room went dead silent. You know, Samantha could have been a Harvard graduate if Brenda had not intercepted the mail. "Yeah, that is right. We all knew about it, Brenda. We all knew you threw her acceptance letter in the shredder, so little baby Jason would not feel bad about failing his community college classes." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. 300 pairs of eyes shifted instantly to the head table. The heavy silence was suffocating. You could hear a pin drop over the soft jazz playing in the background. Kendra slowly turned her head to look at my brother, her smile completely vanishing. Jason gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, his face flushing a deep, angry red. I sat perfectly still. For a brief second, a wave of grief washed over me. 10 years ago, I had waited by the mailbox every single day for that letter. When nothing came, I assumed I had not been good enough. I ended up going to a state college, drowning in $80,000 of student loans while working 2 jobs just to survive. The revelation that my own mother had stolen my future to protect my brother's fragile ego should have broken me. But I had spent the last decade building an emotional fortress. As a forensic accountant and a managing partner at an elite venture capital firm, I had learned to separate emotion from hard data. I turned my head slowly and looked right at my mother. I expected denial. I expected her to play the victim or yell at Uncle Rick for ruining the evening. Instead, Brenda leaned toward me under the cover of the massive floral centerpiece. Her face was perfectly calm, her eyes cold and calculating. Do not make a scene, Samantha. She whispered, her tone laced with absolute venom. Uncle Rick is just a drunk, and even if it were true, you would not have lasted a semester there anyway. You always were too high-strung. She took a delicate sip of her champagne, clearly believing she had won. She thought I would run to the bathroom crying, just like I used to do when I was a teenager. She thought the power dynamic of our family was still exactly the same. But I am not a scared 18-year-old girl anymore. I am a woman who handles multi-million-dollar corporate audits for breakfast. I do not deal in tears. I deal in receipts. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly reached down and unclasped my black leather designer clutch. I pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder bound with a red ribbon and stamped with a public notary seal. The crisp sound of the heavy paper seemed impossibly loud as I slid it across the pristine white tablecloth. It stopped right in front of my mother's dinner plate, knocking over her crystal water glass. "What is this?" Brenda sneered, looking down at the folder with utter disdain. "Another one of your little spreadsheets." "You always were painfully boring, Samantha," I smiled, a real, genuine smile. "It is a copy of grandmother's original trust fund charter from 2008, I said, my voice carrying just enough to reach Kendra and Jason. The exact charter stating that a sum of $200,000 was set aside solely and exclusively for my Ivy League tuition. The very same tuition money you claimed did not exist when you forced me to take out those predatory student loans." Brenda's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Her eyes darted around the table, realizing that Kendra's parents and several bridesmaids were well within earshot. She immediately went into defense mode, utilizing the same gaslighting tactics she had perfected over my entire lifetime. "You are being ridiculous," Brenda hissed, trying to casually push the folder back toward me. "You are ruining your brother's wedding over ancient history. I was the trustee. I had the legal right to reallocate those funds for family emergencies. We were going through a hard time. You are so incredibly selfish for bringing this up now. Be the bigger person for once in your life." Aunt Pamela, who was sitting one table over, leaned in and nodded in agreement. "Really, Samantha," she chimed in, her voice dripping with disapproval. "Your brother is getting married. Can you not just let the past go? You are making everyone uncomfortable. Family emergencies." I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air. I reached forward and casually flipped the heavy cover of the legal folder open to page 2. I had highlighted the bank transfer records in bright yellow. "Is that what we are calling Jason's 3 failed tech startups and this $150,000 wedding? A family emergency?" The color drained completely out of Jason's face. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. He aggressively reached out to grab the folder, but he was not fast enough. Kendra, the beautiful, brilliant bride whose patience was clearly wearing thin, reached out and intercepted the documents. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the financial statements. She pulled the folder toward her side of the table, her eyes scanning the highlighted bank transfers with the speed and precision of a doctor reading a critical chart. "Jason, you told me your seed funding came from a private angel investor." Kendra said, her voice dangerously low and steady. She looked up from the papers, her dark eyes locking onto my brother. "You told me you built your software company from the ground up with outside capital." Jason started to stammer, holding his hands up in a defensive posture. "Baby, listen to me. It is complicated. Business is complicated. Samantha is just twisting the numbers because she has always been jealous of my success. She is trying to ruin our special day." I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands in my lap. I looked right into Kendra's eyes and delivered the truth she deserved to hear. "Oh, he did have an angel investor, Kendra," I said smoothly. "His angel investor was my stolen college fund." Kendra is not a woman who misses details. You do not become a top-tier anesthesiologist by letting things slip past your notice. Her career is built on monitoring vital signs, paying attention to the smallest fluctuations, and knowing exactly when something is going wrong. Right now, her sharp eyes were fixed on my brother Jason, and I could see the exact moment the monitor flatlined in her mind. Jason had always painted himself as the ultimate self-made tech visionary. When they started dating, he told her he was pulling in high six figures from a software company he built from scratch. He promised her that he would cover the entire cost of this wedding because he wanted to treat his bride like a queen. He swore to her that his business was booming and the wedding was entirely funded by his own corporate profits. Hearing the words stolen college fund and failed tech startups in the same sentence was like ice water being thrown over the extravagant sweetheart table. I watched Kendra slowly process the math. The vibrant joy that had been radiating from her beautiful dark skin all evening was completely gone, replaced by cold, clinical calculation. The silence at the table was heavy and suffocating. You could hear the faint clinking of silverware from the oblivious guests at the far end of the ballroom, but up here at the head table, the air was thick with panic. Jason was sweating. He tugged at the collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo, looking frantically between me, our mother, and his new bride. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded unnatural. "Kendra, baby, do not listen to her," Jason stammered, reaching out to put his hand over hers. "She is just bitter. You know how she gets. I told you about her, right? She has always held a grudge because she had to go to a state school while I was out here building my empire. I have investors, Kendra. Real investors. Big venture capital firms in Silicon Valley who believe in my vision. Why would I need a trust fund when I am closing million-dollar rounds?" But Jason was making a fatal flaw. He was talking too fast and Kendra was too smart. She pulled her hand away. Her gaze was locked entirely on the heavy legal folder resting on the white tablecloth right in front of our mother. "Let me see that folder." Kendra said, her voice perfectly level, but carrying a weight that demanded absolute obedience. It was the voice she used when commanding a surgical team in the operating room. Brenda visibly panicked. My mother had spent her entire life controlling the narrative, and suddenly the script was being torn to shreds in front of her country club friends. "No, this is private family business, Kendra, sweetheart." Brenda chirped, her voice artificially high and sweet. She reached out her manicured hands and grabbed the edge of the folder, trying to pull it off the table and into her lap. "We do not need to ruin your beautiful wedding day with Samantha and her ridiculous spreadsheets. Let us just go dance. The band is playing your favorite song." But Kendra did not move. She leaned forward, her posture rigid and authoritative. "I said, let me see the folder, Brenda," Kendra repeated. Brenda let out a nervous gasp and yanked the folder harder, but Kendra was faster. With lightning reflexes, Kendra reached across the floral centerpiece and clamped her hand firmly onto the opposite side of the legal document. For 5 excruciating seconds, the bride and the mother of the groom were locked in a silent physical tug-of-war over the evidence of my stolen future. Brenda tried to laugh it off, but her eyes were wild with desperation. "Kendra, please, you are causing a scene," Brenda whispered through gritted teeth, leaning in close so the nearby tables would not hear. "You do not understand how things work in our family. Samantha is unwell. She makes things up for attention. You are a doctor, you should recognize a mental breakdown when you see one. Let the folder go and we can all just pretend this never happened." I watched my mother attempt to weaponize psychology against a highly trained medical professional, and I almost laughed. Kendra did not even blink. She tightened her grip on the thick paper. "Brenda, if you do not let go of this folder right now, I will stand up, grab that microphone from Uncle Rick, and ask the entire ballroom to help me read it," Kendra stated calmly. The threat hung in the air, sharp and absolute. Brenda knew Kendra was not bluffing. Kendra was a fiercely independent woman who paid for her own medical school and bought her own house before she ever met Jason. Defeated and shaking, Brenda slowly released her fingers from the cardboard cover. She slumped back in her chair, shooting me a glare filled with pure hatred, while trying to maintain a stiff smile for the photographers circling the room. Kendra pulled the heavy folder directly into her lap, right over the delicate silk of her custom wedding gown. She opened the cover and began flipping through the pages. The document was meticulously organized, because that is exactly what I do for a living. I had included the original 2008 trust fund charter with my grandmother's signature, followed by the official bank transfer logs from my mother's account. Kendra's eyes darted back and forth across the pages, scanning the highlighted dates and the massive withdrawal amounts. I watched her perfectly arched eyebrows furrow as she traced a line with her finger from the trust fund depletion directly into Jason's supposedly self-funded business account. A heavy, suffocating dread washed over Jason. He sat completely paralyzed, watching his entire fake persona crumble under the clinical scrutiny of his own bride. Kendra flipped to the final page, which detailed the exact origin of the seed money Jason had used to launch his fake software company and pay for this lavish reception. She stared at the numbers for a long time, taking a slow, deep breath before finally looking up. Her eyes met mine across the table, and I saw the devastating realization wash over her. Jason's mysterious angel investor was not a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. It was my stolen college fund. Jason watched the realization wash over Kendra, and his demeanor shifted. The tech visionary persona he had crafted evaporated. He stood up, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the polished floor. The sound echoed, drawing attention from the guests, who were straining to see the drama at the head table. When a narcissist is backed into a corner, they do not apologize, they attack. Jason slammed his hands flat on the table, leaning toward me with a look of pure rage. He was sweating profusely but forced a loud, condescending laugh. "You always do this, Samantha," Jason yelled, his voice echoing across the floral centerpieces. "You just cannot stand to see me happy. You cannot stand that I am successful, and you are just a miserable bean counter. You have been jealous of me since we were kids because Mom believed in my potential, and she knew you were never going to amount to anything special." I sat perfectly still, letting his words wash over me. 10 years ago, a speech like that would have sent me running from the room in tears. I would have believed him. I would have internalized the shame. But today his words meant absolutely nothing. I looked at Kendra, who was sitting frozen, holding the bank statements in her lap. Jason turned his attention back to her, desperately trying to salvage his crumbling empire. "Kendra, baby, listen to me," Jason pleaded, softening his voice, but keeping his aggressive posture. "She is twisting the narrative to make me look bad. Yes, Mom gave me a loan to start my company. It was a family investment. But that money was just the seed. What I built with it is worth 10 times that amount now. I am the CEO of a revolutionary software platform. You know how hard I work. You see me taking calls at all hours of the night." Kendra did not look convinced. She looked down at the highlighted bank transfers showing hundreds of thousands of dollars vanishing into thin air. Jason saw her hesitation and doubled down on his lies, escalating his claims to an absurd degree. "My app is about to be acquired, Kendra," Jason announced, puffing out his chest and looking around the table. "I am in the final stages of closing a massive buyout with a top-tier venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. We are talking multi-millions. The deal is basically done. We are waiting on the final audit. I wanted to surprise you and buy you that mansion in the hills you always wanted. Samantha knows this. She looked up my company online, saw that I am about to be filthy rich, and decided to bring up ancient history about a stupid college fund to get a piece of the pie. She is trying to extort us." Brenda immediately jumped in to support her golden child. She clapped her hands together, nodding vigorously. "Exactly," Brenda chimed in, glaring at me. "You are trying to steal your brother's joy because you are bitter. You have always been so vindictive, Samantha. You should be ashamed of yourself for trying to ruin this beautiful celebration just because you are greedy." I looked at my mother, and then I looked at my brother. I let their accusations hang in the air for a long moment. I let them paint me as the jealous, vindictive sister trying to extort the wildly successful tech genius. I let them dig their hole as deep as possible in front of 300 witnesses. And then I did something that completely shattered their remaining confidence. I laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or an angry laugh. It was a genuine, deeply amused chuckle that bubbled up from the bottom of my chest. The sound of my laughter caught Jason completely off guard. He blinked, his mouth hanging open slightly. He expected me to argue. He expected me to defend myself against his accusations of extortion and jealousy. He did not expect me to find him funny. "You are in the final stages of an acquisition," I asked, my voice calm and perfectly even. "A multi-million-dollar buyout from a top-tier venture capital firm. That is incredibly impressive, Jason. It really is." Jason narrowed his eyes, his confidence faltering for a second before his ego took over again. "Yes, it is," he spat back. "So you can pack up your little printed spreadsheets and get out of my wedding. You are not getting a single dime of my buyout money." I did not pack up my spreadsheets. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag sitting on the floor. I bypassed the legal folders and pulled out my silver work iPad. The Grand Plaza Hotel was a state-of-the-art venue. I knew this because my corporate team frequently rented this exact ballroom for our annual investor galas. I knew the master audio-visual control panel was built directly into the side of the head table. I stood slowly smoothing the skirt of my dress. I walked over to the side of the table where the small digital interface was glowing softly. I pulled a small adapter cable from my bag and plugged my iPad directly into the venue's main projection system. "What are you doing?" Jason demanded, his voice suddenly wavering with genuine panic. "Get away from there! Security! Somebody get her away from the table!" I completely ignored him. I tapped the screen of my iPad, entering my secure corporate passcode. "Let us take a look at that multi-million-dollar buyout, Jason," I said smoothly. "Since we are all family here, I think everyone would love to see the details of this revolutionary software platform you have built." I swiped my finger across the glass screen, and a massive document appeared, projected brightly onto the pristine white wall behind the head table, for every single guest to clearly see. The white wall behind the head table instantly transformed into a massive glowing billboard. A collective murmur rippled through the ballroom as the guests squinted to read the bold text. The header featured a sleek, geometric logo. It was the crest of Vanguard Horizon Capital. This was not just any firm. It was the exact Silicon Valley powerhouse Jason had been bragging about all evening. The firm he claimed was begging to buy his software for millions. Jason stared at the wall. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked back at me, his face twisting into pure disbelief. "How did you get that?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "You hacked my email. You are committing corporate espionage, Samantha. I am calling the police. You cannot project confidential buyout documents at my wedding." I walked slowly back to my chair. I smoothed my dress and sat down with absolute composure. "I did not hack your email, Jason," I replied, my voice projecting clearly. "And these are not confidential buyout documents. This is an internal rejection portfolio. I have access to it because I am the one who wrote it." Jason let out a loud, mocking scoff, but it sounded entirely hollow. "You wrote it!" he sneered, looking around the table as if trying to rally the audience. "You are a mid-level accountant at some boring corporate firm. You do not work for Vanguard Horizon. That is exactly where you are wrong," I said, leaning forward slightly. 10 years ago, when Mom stole my college fund, I had to make a choice. I channeled that anger into my education. I took out student loans and went to a state university. I studied late while you failed out of your expensive private college. I became a forensic accountant. I specialize in tearing apart fraudulent companies. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the table. Kendra was watching me intently, her dark eyes wide with sudden understanding. "I do not just work for Vanguard Horizon Capital, Jason." I continued, my voice dropping to a clinical tone. "I am a managing partner. I oversee the entire due diligence department. Every tech startup asking for millions of dollars has to go through my team first. We stop con artists from stealing investor money." Brenda let out a small, choked gasp. Her perfectly manicured hands flew up to cover her mouth. For the first time, she was looking at me not as the quiet daughter she could manipulate, but as a woman who held absolute power over her golden child's future. 3 months ago, a pitch deck landed on my desk. I explained, keeping my gaze locked on Jason. It was for a supposedly revolutionary software platform. The founder was asking for a $2 million seed investment. He claimed he had proprietary algorithms. The founder was you, Jason. Jason swallowed hard. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. You reviewed my company. He whispered, his arrogant facade dissolving into genuine terror. I did. I nodded. Because of our conflict of interest, I could not personally authorize the funding. So I handed your pitch deck over to my investigation team for a blind anonymous audit. I did not tell them you were my brother. I simply told them to tear the company apart and show me what was actually running under the hood. I tapped the screen of my iPad. The projection shifted to the second page of the document. It was a brutal technical summary. I looked over at Kendra, who was already reading the giant text on the wall. Kendra, I know you work incredibly hard for your money, I said, addressing this bride directly. You save lives every single day. You understand the value of hard work and honesty. I think you deserve to know exactly what your husband considers a thriving business. I turned back to Jason. My team spent 4 weeks digging into your tech infrastructure. Do you want to know what they found? They found absolutely nothing. You do not have a revolutionary software platform. You do not have proprietary algorithms. You do not have a single line of back-end code. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning unit. Jason looked like he was going to be sick. He grabbed the edge of the table, bracing himself. The audit revealed that your business is just a hollow shell. I announced, my voice echoing through the room. You took my stolen trust fund and paid a freelance graphic designer $3,000 to build a wireframe interface. It is just empty, clickable pictures that lead nowhere. There is no database. No, there is no cloud infrastructure. You stole open-source assets and slapped your logo on them. Kendra let out a sharp breath. She looked at the bank statements in her lap, and then at the projected audit report. You lied to me, she whispered to Jason. Her voice was barely audible, but the devastation was absolute. You told me you were coding all night. You told me you were building a legacy for our future children. I was. Jason pleaded, reaching for her hand. I just needed more time. The tech was coming. I had to secure the funding first. I was faking it until I made it, Kendra. That is what everyone in Silicon Valley does. It is not a crime. Actually, when you falsify technical documents to secure investments, it is called criminal fraud. I corrected him sharply. My firm rejected your pitch immediately. You were never getting a buyout, Jason. You were never getting a single dime from Vanguard, Horizon, or anyone else. Your fake company is entirely worthless. Brenda tried to intervene and spin the narrative. Okay, fine, she interrupted, waving her hands frantically. So his business needs more work. That does not mean he is a bad person, Kendra. Startups fail all the time. It is part of the journey. He still has the seed money. He can pivot and start something new. I looked at my mother and felt a cold wave of satisfaction wash over me. She had just walked right into the final trap. I reached down and tapped the screen of my iPad one more time. The projection on the wall shifted again. That is a fascinating point, Mother, I said smoothly. A responsible entrepreneur would absolutely pivot. They would conserve their capital and try again. But that brings us to the most interesting part of the forensic audit. The financial breakdown. I looked right at Kendra, who was quietly waiting for the final devastating blow. In the venture capital world, Kendra, we use a specific term called the burn rate. I explained, keeping my tone completely educational. It measures exactly how fast a company spends its initial seed money before generating profit. Since Jason only spent $3,000 on his fake software, we naturally had to ask where the other $197,000 of my stolen college fund actually went. The dark answer to that pressing question is going to clearly show you exactly who you just married today. The term burn rate sounds incredibly clinical, but in forensic accounting, it tells a very human story. It tells you exactly what a person values when they think nobody is watching. I tapped the screen of my iPad again, and the massive projection on the ballroom wall shifted to a detailed pie chart. The bright colors illuminated the shocked faces of the guests sitting closest to the head table. Jason, you claimed you needed $200,000 to build a revolutionary software company. But my team followed the digital paper trail. We tracked every single wire transfer and credit card swipe attached to your so-called corporate accounts. And Kendra, I need you to look at this very carefully, because this is the foundation of the marriage you just entered into. Kendra did not look away. She stared at the wall, her jaw set with absolute tension. I began to read the line items aloud, letting my voice carry clearly over the silent room. $35,000 was immediately transferred to a luxury auto dealership in downtown Seattle. That was the down payment for the matte black Porsche Cayenne you drove up in today, Jason. The one you told Kendra was a company car provided by your board of directors. You do not have a board of directors. You have my stolen college fund. Another $18,000 went straight to a high-end jeweler. That covered the custom Rolex watch currently sitting on your left wrist. The same watch you proudly showed off during your rehearsal dinner speech as a symbol of your hard work and entrepreneurial grind. Jason tried to cover his left wrist with his right hand, a pathetic and instinctive gesture of guilt. Kendra turned her head slowly and looked at his watch. The disgust in her eyes was profound. I kept going, refusing to give him a single second to breathe. Then there is the entertainment budget. I continued, my tone completely flat and professional. Over the past 12 months, $42,000 was spent at premium nightclubs and VIP lounges across the city, bottle service, private tables, and extravagant bar tabs. Kendra, you thought Jason was working late at the office coding his software and securing venture capital. In reality, he was treating his friends to expensive champagne and pretending to be a Silicon Valley billionaire on my dime. He bought your affection and your trust with stolen money. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of his financial waste sink into the minds of everyone listening to my presentation. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was deafening as the projected pie chart glowed brightly against the stark white wall. Brenda was gripping the edges of the table, her knuckles completely white with suppressed anger and sheer panic. Jason was staring at his lap, unable to meet Kendra's eyes for even a brief passing second. The contrast between my brother's life and my own was staggering, and I wanted everyone in that room to understand exactly what that stolen $200,000 had actually cost me over the last decade of my life. You see, Jason, while you were out playing the role of a wealthy chief executive officer, I was living a very different reality, I said, my voice dropping to a softer but far more intense register. When Mom threw my Harvard acceptance letter in the shredder, she did not just take away a prestigious name on a diploma. She took away my financial security. Because I still wanted an education, I had no choice but to enroll in a local state college. Mom refused to co-sign any of my loans because she claimed all the family money was tied up in emergency investments. So I took on $80,000 in predatory student debt at 18 years old, just so I could get a bachelor degree in accounting. I walked around the table slowly, making sure Jason had to look up at me. While you were taking European gap years and leasing luxury cars, I was working 80-hour weeks. I worked overnight shifts auditing small businesses just to make my minimum monthly loan payments. I lived in a tiny studio apartment with a broken heater, eating canned soup because every spare dollar I earned went straight to the bank. I missed holidays. I missed birthdays. I sacrificed my entire 20s to build the career I have now. I learned how to track hidden assets and expose corporate fraud because I had to survive in a world where my own family had deliberately set me up to fail. You stole my foundation, Jason, and you used it to buy VIP tables and shiny watches. You threw away my future so you could play pretend. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Kendra looked absolutely devastated. She was a woman who had worked grueling shifts in medical school to earn her place in the world. Hearing how my brother had squandered a stolen fortune, while I clawed my way out of debt, shattered whatever illusion of love she had left for him. But toxic families do not appreciate the truth. They rely on silence to survive. And I had just shattered their silence in front of 300 important guests. Suddenly, the loud scraping of a heavy wooden chair echoed sharply across the quiet room. Aunt Pamela, who had been sitting exactly one table over, stood up abruptly, knocking over her champagne glass in the rapid process. The pale yellow liquid spilled out, soaking into the expensive white tablecloth. Her face was red with pure indignation, and she pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face as she prepared to defend her sister. "How dare you, Samantha!" Aunt Pamela screamed, her voice shrill and echoing through the microphone Uncle Rick had left turned on. "You are an absolute monster. Look at what you are doing. You are ruining a beautiful day. This is a wedding celebration, not a courtroom. How can you be so cruel to your own mother and brother in front of all these people?" Almost instantly, a chorus of agreement rose from the other enablers in the room. Two of my mother's country club friends stood up shouting that I was acting like a bitter, jealous child. Brenda, seeing an opportunity to regain control, immediately burst into theatrical tears. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly and leaning heavily against Jason's shoulder. "Oh, Pamela, please help me," Brenda wailed, playing the victim flawlessly. "I do not know why she is doing this. I have only ever tried to be a good mother. She is trying to destroy our family out of pure spite." Jason jumped on the bandwagon, wrapping his arm protectively around our mother. "You need to leave right now, Samantha." Jason shouted, his voice regaining some of its aggressive edge, now that he had an audience backing him up. "You have upset Mom. You have completely ruined my wedding. Security should have thrown you out 10 minutes ago. Get out of our sight before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing on this property." Jason stood towering over the table with his face twisted in a mixture of fear and pure anger. He demanded that I leave immediately, shouting that I had ruined his perfect day. My mother Brenda was clinging to his arm, putting on the performance of a lifetime. She was weeping loudly, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk napkin, and wailing about how I had always been a cruel and vindictive daughter. Aunt Pamela was busy consoling her, rubbing her back and glaring at me, as if I had just committed a terrible crime against our family. The other guests at the head table were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do, while the rest of the ballroom watched the spectacle unfold. But amidst all the screaming and the theatrical tears, I remained perfectly calm. I did not break eye contact with Kendra, who was still staring in absolute horror at the projected financial data on the wall. I wanted Kendra to see exactly how my family operated when they were backed into a corner. They did not take accountability. They deflected, blamed, and threw massive tantrums to distract everyone from their own guilt. When Brenda realized that her fake tears were not working on me, she abruptly stopped crying. It was almost frightening how quickly the mask of the heartbroken mother vanished from her face. Her posture straightened instantly, and her eyes hardened into tiny, cold slits. She looked around the grand room, realizing that her wealthy friends, the wives of local politicians and corporate executives, were actively whispering behind their hands. Her pristine social image, the very thing she valued above her own children, was actively crumbling right before her eyes. This wedding was supposed to be her ultimate crowning achievement. It was supposed to prove to everyone that she was a successful matriarch who had raised a brilliant billionaire son. Instead, I had just exposed her as a complete fraud and a thief. Brenda knew she had to remove the source of her humiliation immediately. She could not logically refute the forensic audit or the bank statements, so her only remaining option was sheer brute force and total social intimidation. We were currently sitting in the magnificent ballroom of the Oak Creek Country Club. This specific place was the absolute center of my mother's entire universe. She had spent the last 20 years aggressively climbing the social ladder here, stepping on anyone who got in her way. Brenda currently held a platinum tier membership, which was the highest and most exclusive status available at the facility. It granted her priority booking private dining rooms and an inflated sense of ultimate authority over the staff and the other members. To Brenda, the walls of this club were her fortress, and the employees were her personal servants. She firmly believed that her elite membership card made her practically untouchable within these gated grounds. She looked down at me, sitting calmly in my chair with my work tablet, and she made a final, desperate decision. She was going to use her beloved country club to publicly humiliate me and rapidly reassert her dominance. Brenda snapped her manicured fingers, signaling a waiter who rushed over looking incredibly nervous. "Go get Mr. Harrison right this instant." Brenda barked, her voice echoing across the tense room. "Tell the general manager I need him at the head table immediately and bring security guards." The waiter nodded frantically and sprinted out of the ballroom. Jason let out a loud, arrogant laugh, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a smug expression, believing that our mother had just won the battle. "You thought you could come in here and show fake documents and get away with it?" Jason sneered loudly for the guests to hear. "You are about to be dragged out of here in front of everyone, Samantha. You are going to be permanently banned from the premises today. This is Mom's territory, and you have zero power here." I simply smiled and took a slow sip of my water. I did not pack up my documents. I did not unplug my tablet from the projection system. I just sat back and waited for the show. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. Mr. Harrison, the longtime general manager of Oak Creek, walked briskly into the room. He was a tall, older man who usually carried himself with immense pride and undeniable authority. But tonight, as he approached the head table, something was noticeably different about him. He looked extremely pale. He was sweating slightly, and his dark eyes darted nervously around the crowded room. 2 large security guards dressed in crisp dark suits followed closely behind him. Brenda stood up tall, smoothing out her expensive silk dress and lifting her chin in a grand display of absolute superiority. She pointed a sharp manicured finger directly at my face as Mr. Harrison finally reached the large table. "Mr. Harrison, thank goodness you are here," Brenda announced, her voice loud so her wealthy friends would hear. "This woman has crashed my son's wedding. She is harassing the bride and projecting unauthorized defamatory materials onto the walls of your establishment. As a platinum member of this club, I am officially demanding that you have your security team remove her from the property immediately. Drag her out by her arms. I want her permanently banned from Oak Creek starting right now and never allowed back inside." Brenda crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She waited eagerly for the general manager to signal his guards and aggressively grab me. But the strong guards did not move. Mr. Harrison did not even look at my angry mother. He did not offer any apologies to her either. Instead, the general manager stood frozen tightly, holding his black clipboard. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at me, awaiting my orders. The silence in the grand ballroom was profound. 300 guests were holding their breath. Brenda stood tall at the head table with her chin raised high, fully expecting the general manager to follow her commands. She had spent the last 20 years treating the staff at Oak Creek Country Club like her own personal servants. She truly believed that her platinum membership card gave her the absolute right to have her own daughter physically dragged out of a wedding reception. 2 large security guards stood a few feet away from my chair, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Harrison, the general manager, stood between them, clutching his clipboard. He did not look at my mother. He kept his dark eyes locked entirely on me, and I could see sweat forming on his forehead. Brenda pointed her finger at me again and loudly repeated her demand for my immediate removal. She expected immediate compliance. I did not break eye contact with Mr. Harrison. I slowly took a sip of my ice water, set the crystal glass down on the white tablecloth, and gave him a very small, reassuring nod. "It is all right, Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice calm and perfectly level. "You and your security team can stand down. I will not be leaving the property today, but I appreciate you coming up here so quickly." Mr. Harrison let out a massive breath of relief. He immediately nodded his head and took a large step back away from the table. "Yes, ma'am," he replied softly. "Please let me know if you need anything else." Brenda looked like she had just been slapped across the face. Her jaw dropped open and her eyes darted wildly between me and the retreating general manager. "What are you doing?" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking with pure indignation. "Do not walk away from me, Mr. Harrison. I am a platinum member of this club. I demand that you throw this woman out right now, or I will have the board of directors fire you by tomorrow morning." Mr. Harrison stopped walking. He turned around slowly and looked at my mother with a mixture of pity and absolute dread. "I'm incredibly sorry, Brenda," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying a tone of finality. "But I cannot do that. I take my orders directly from the owner of the establishment." Brenda blinked rapidly, clearly unable to process the words he had just spoken. "The owner," she repeated, letting out a sharp, forced laugh. "The owner of this club is a corporate board based in Chicago. They are not even here. What are you talking about?" I reached over to my work tablet, which was plugged into the venue projection system. I swiped my finger across the screen and the massive image on the wall shifted. The forensic audit disappeared. In its place, a highly official legal document appeared glowing brightly over the head table. It was a corporate transfer of ownership filled with heavy legal terminology and stamped with state seals. I looked at Kendra, who was leaning forward to read the new document. I wanted the bride to fully understand the level of power I had spent the last 10 years building, while my brother was busy playing pretend. Oak Creek Country Club used to be owned by a corporate board in Chicago. I explained, speaking clearly so the entire ballroom could hear my voice. But what Mom and her wealthy friends do not know is that this beautiful facility has been quietly hemorrhaging money for the past 5 years. The board mismanaged the pension funds they took on too many expensive renovation projects, and membership renewals have been steadily declining. 3 weeks ago, the Chicago board filed for corporate bankruptcy. They put the massive debt of this entire property up for private auction. I paused, letting the reality of the situation sink in. Brenda was staring at the wall, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. The women from her elite social circle who were sitting at the nearby tables began whispering frantically to each other. Their beloved exclusive sanctuary was bankrupt, and they had absolutely no idea. My holding company specializes in acquiring distressed assets. I continued, my tone completely clinical and detached. When I saw the financial portfolio for Oak Creek cross my desk, I immediately recognized the address. I knew this was the exact place where my mother spent all her time bragging about her golden child. I knew this was the exact venue where Jason planned to host his fake billionaire wedding. So I made a phone call. I wired the necessary funds from my corporate account, and I bought the debt. I stood up from my chair and walked around the table, slowly approaching my mother. She instinctively took a step back, bumping into Jason, who looked absolutely terrified. "I own this country club, Mom," I said, looking directly into her panicked eyes. "I own the golf course. I own the tennis courts. I own the grand ballroom we are standing in right now. I am the sole majority stakeholder of this entire property, which means Mr. Harrison works for me. And you cannot order my staff to throw me out of my own building." The silence that followed was absolute. The power dynamic in the room had just violently shifted, and there was nothing Brenda could do to stop it. The grand illusion she had spent decades building was completely shattered. She was not a powerful matriarch. She was just a guest, sitting in a building owned by the daughter she had callously discarded 10 years ago. Brenda desperately looked around the room, searching for an ally. She looked at her wealthy friends, hoping they would defend her. But high society is incredibly fickle. The women who had just been comforting her were now actively looking away. They were pretending to check their phones or finding their champagne glasses very interesting. Nobody wanted to be associated with a woman publicly exposed as a thief and stripped of her social power. Brenda was entirely alone. Jason tried to step forward, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to intimidate me. "You cannot do this," he stammered, his voice shaking badly. You cannot just buy a country club to ruin my wedding. You are sick, Samantha. You need psychological help. I turned my attention to my brother. I did not buy this club to ruin your wedding, Jason. I bought it because it is a highly profitable real estate investment once the management is restructured. Revealing your massive fraud in front of your beautiful bride is just a convenient bonus. I walked back to my chair and slowly picked up my glass of water. The show was almost over, but I had one final devastating piece of information to deliver. I looked at Brenda, who was leaning heavily against the table, looking like she might actually faint from the sheer magnitude of her embarrassment. She was clutching her designer purse like a life raft. But since we are on the topic of distressed assets and purchasing debts, I think we need to clear the air completely. I said, my voice dropping to a quiet level that forced everyone to listen closely. Buying the debt of a failing country club was just a business transaction, Mom. It was barely a blip on my financial report. But the country club is not the only debt my holding company purchased recently. There was another account that crossed my desk last Tuesday morning. A much more personal account involving a second mortgage. And that specific purchase is going to change your current living situation very quickly. Let me show you exactly what happens when you steal from your own daughter. Brenda was trembling. Losing the country club had completely shattered her carefully constructed social armor. Losing her status was only the beginning of her nightmare. I looked around and noticed that the remaining guests were silent. Even Aunt Pamela had stopped rubbing my mother's back and had taken a cautious step away from her. When you expose a toxic family dynamic, people might still take sides. But when you introduce hard financial evidence of corporate crimes, people tend to scatter. Nobody wants to be associated with a federal investigation. I turned my attention back to my mother, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She had always treated money as a tool for manipulation. She thought that because she was my mother, the standard laws of the financial world did not apply to her. She operated under the arrogant assumption that family ties gave her total immunity from consequences. I needed to make her understand how wrong she was. Mom, you have spent your entire life believing that you could rewrite the rules whenever it suited you. I began, my voice ringing clearly in the quiet room. You thought that emptying my college fund was just a disciplinary measure. You thought you were just reallocating family resources to help your favorite child. But the federal government does not use those words. They use much harsher terminology. I picked up the thick folder from the table and held it up for everyone to see. When grandmother established this trust in 2008, she did not just hand you a pile of cash. She created a legally binding entity. She appointed you as the primary trustee. Do you know what that means, Mom? It means you were legally bound by fiduciary duty. You were required by law to manage that $200,000 strictly for my benefit and my benefit alone. You did not own that money. You were merely the guardian of it. When you deliberately withdrew those funds and handed them over to Jason so he could pretend to be a technology chief executive officer, you did not just break a promise to me. You committed a severe breach of fiduciary duty. Brenda swallowed hard, her throat visibly clicking. She tried to open her mouth to argue, to offer some twisted justification about how Jason was a better investment, but the words failed her. The legal reality was finally crashing down on her. Kendra, the bride, was watching my mother with an expression of pure disgust. Kendra understood the weight of legal responsibility. In the medical field, negligence and breach of duty destroyed careers and ruined lives. She was now realizing that the woman she almost called her mother-in-law was nothing more than a common thief wearing an expensive designer dress. I could see Kendra mentally calculating the exact amount of legal liability she was standing next to. Jason was shifting his weight, looking like a cornered animal. He had always relied on our mother to fix his messes and shield him from the real world. But right now, Brenda could not even shield herself. But a breach of fiduciary duty is a civil matter. I paced behind my chair to maintain a commanding presence. It means I could sue you in state court and bankrupt you, which I am fully prepared to do. However, you made a much bigger mistake. A mistake that elevates this entire situation from a simple family dispute into a serious federal crime. I looked over at the wall where my tablet was still connected. I tapped the screen and the projection shifted back to the highlighted bank statements. I want everyone to look closely at the routing numbers on these transfers. I pointed to the glowing digital numbers. Mom, you did not just hand Jason a paper check. You used the banking system to electronically wire my trust fund from your local account here in Washington directly to Jason's newly opened corporate business account in California. You crossed state lines. You used telecommunications to execute a fraudulent transfer of stolen assets. Under Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code, that is the exact legal definition of federal wire fraud. A collective gasp echoed from the tables closest to the front. The wealthy guests who had been attending this wedding to network and show off their own status were suddenly realizing they were witnesses to the exposure of a major felony. Federal wire fraud carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for each individual count. And based on these banking records, Mom, you executed 12 separate wire transfers over the course of 8 months. You did not just make a single mistake. You engaged in a systematic, deliberate pattern of criminal behavior to fund a fake software company. Brenda let out a small, pathetic whimper. Her knees visibly buckled, and she had to grab the edge of the pristine white tablecloth to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. The heavy crystal glasses on the table rattled loudly against the porcelain plates. Prison. She was facing federal prison. The woman who obsessed over country club tears and neighborhood gossip was suddenly confronting the terrifying reality of a federal indictment. Jason was pale. He finally realized that his mother could not save him because she was going down with him. "You are lying!" Jason yelled, his voice completely lacking any of its previous arrogant power. "You are just trying to scare us. Mom did not know it was a federal crime. She just wanted to help me." "Ignorance of the law is not a valid defense, Jason," I replied coldly, my eyes never leaving my mother's face. "The federal investigators at the Securities and Exchange Commission will not care that she is your mother. They will only see a trustee who embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars and wired them across state boundaries. And the most pathetic part of this entire situation is that Mom knew what she was doing was highly illegal." I walked back to my tablet and picked it up. "You see, Kendra, people who commit financial fraud leave a specific trail of panic when they realize an audit is coming," I said, looking directly at the bride. 3 months ago, when Jason submitted his fake pitch deck, my investigation team requested a standard proof of funds. They asked Jason to verify the origin of his initial seed capital. Jason panicked and called Mom. He told her a major firm was looking into his finances. Brenda knew if an accounting firm audited the trust, she would be exposed as a criminal. She had to magically replace the missing $200,000 before my team could flag the accounts for embezzlement. But Mom had already spent all her liquid savings maintaining her lavish lifestyle and funding Jason's fake persona. She was completely broke on paper. So in a desperate attempt to cover up her federal crimes and save her golden child from a fraud investigation, my mother made the single worst financial decision of her entire life. She went to a predatory bank and mortgaged her future. The grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel felt completely different now. What had started as a joyous celebration of my brother's fake success had turned into a masterclass in absolute financial ruin. I stood at the head table looking down at my mother. Brenda was gripping the edge of the tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were completely white. The threat of a federal wire fraud investigation hung over her head like a heavy, dark cloud. She had always thought of herself as the smartest person in any room. She firmly believed that her status at the country club and her perfectly manicured suburban life made her entirely untouchable. But financial crimes leave a permanent digital fingerprint that no amount of expensive perfume can wash away. When people who are used to lying suddenly realize they are about to be caught, they usually panic. And when arrogant people panic, they make incredibly stupid financial decisions. I walked slowly back to my leather tote bag. The guests were completely silent, watching my every move. Kendra, the beautiful bride, was sitting perfectly still, absorbing every single piece of information. She was not crying. She was analyzing. She was watching the family she almost married into completely self-destruct with the clinical precision of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal disease. Mom, you knew that if my accounting firm audited Jason's fake software company, the missing $200,000 would trigger an immediate red flag. I said, keeping my voice calm and conversational. You knew that a missing trust fund would automatically generate an alert to the Internal Revenue Service. The federal government does not take kindly to missing assets, especially when those assets are tied to a legal fiduciary account. You needed to magically replace the exact amount of money you stole before my team could officially report the discrepancy to the authorities. But you had a massive problem. You had already spent all of your own cash trying to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. You had absolutely nothing left in your checking account. You had nothing in your savings. You were completely broke on paper. So you looked at the only real tangible asset you had left, your pristine four-bedroom colonial house in the suburbs, the house with the heated swimming pool and the perfect landscaping, the house where you used to lock me in my room while you threw lavish dinner parties for your wealthy friends. You loved that house more than you ever loved me. You decided to leverage your entire future just to cover your tracks. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper. It was not bound in a folder this time. It did not need to be. The bold red letters at the top of the page spoke entirely for themselves. You went to a predatory lending institution and you took out a massive second mortgage on your home. I held the paper up, letting the bright overhead lights illuminate the official bank seal. You borrowed $250,000 at an incredibly high interest rate. You planned to quietly slide that money back into the trust account and pretend nothing ever happened before the auditors arrived. You thought you could just pay off the massive monthly loan installments by having Jason give you a cut of his imaginary software buyout. You bet your entire life on a fake company that did not even have a single line of working code. You gambled your entire reality on Jason's lies. Brenda let out a sharp gasp. She reached her hand up to her chest as if she could not breathe. Jason looked at our mother in absolute shock. He did not know about this part of the plan. He had been so entirely consumed by his own lies that he never stopped to ask how our mother was funding his lifestyle. Mom, you took out a second mortgage for me. Jason whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound guilt and terror. Brenda could not even look at him. She stared at the piece of paper in my hand, her perfectly applied makeup completely failing to hide the absolute despair washing over her face. Yes, Jason, she did. I answered for her. And she made a terrible mathematical error. Without your fake software buyout, Mom had absolutely no way to make the monthly payments on that new massive loan. She drained her credit cards trying to keep up. She stopped paying her other utility bills. But the mathematics of debt do not care about your social standing or your country club memberships. The numbers always catch up to you in the very end. I walked around the table and placed the single sheet of paper directly in front of my mother, right next to her half-empty champagne glass. This is a notice of default. I announced, my voice echoing through the quiet ballroom. For those of you who do not work in high-level finance, a notice of default is the very first official step in the real estate foreclosure process. It means the bank has officially recognized that the borrower has failed to meet their legal financial obligations. Mom, you missed 3 consecutive payments on your second mortgage. You ignored the phone calls from the collection agencies. You threw the warning letters into the trash because you were too busy planning this $150,000 wedding. You wanted to play the role of the wealthy mother of the groom one last time before the walls completely caved in around you. You defaulted on your loan exactly 1 week ago today. Last Tuesday, the bank officially initiated the foreclosure process on your beautiful suburban home. The wealthy women sitting at the tables near the front of the room actually gasped out loud. In their elite circle, losing a home to foreclosure was the ultimate social disgrace. It was a clear, undeniable signal of total financial ruin. Brenda was no longer just a criminal in their eyes. She was poor. And in her shallow world, being poor was the absolute worst crime a person could ever commit. Aunt Pamela, who had been defending her sister all evening, slowly sat back down in her chair. She crossed her arms and looked away completely, distancing herself from the disaster unfolding at the head table. Brenda was entirely isolated. She looked down at the notice of default, and a single tear finally rolled down her cheek, ruining her expensive foundation. She tried to reach out and touch the paper, but her hand was shaking too violently. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. "You are going to lose the house," Jason said, stating the obvious as his own panic began to peak. "Where are we going to live, Mom? We cannot lose the house." Brenda finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic whisper. "The bank will give me an extension," Brenda pleaded, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "I can call them on Monday morning. I can explain the entire situation. I have been a loyal customer for 30 years. They will give me a grace period to figure this out. I can sell my jewelry. I can sell the cars. Just please, Samantha, do not humiliate me any further." I looked down at the woman who had intentionally destroyed my college dreams. The woman who had thrown away my Harvard acceptance letter without a single ounce of regret. I felt absolutely no pity for her. I reached forward and tapped my index finger right on the bottom corner of the notice of default. "I'm afraid you cannot call the bank on Monday morning, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper that cut through the silence of the room. "Because the bank does not own your mortgage anymore." When a high-risk loan goes into severe default, the lending institution usually auctions off the debt to a private commercial holding company to quickly recoup their losses and clear their balance sheets. They do not care about your 30 years of loyalty or your expensive jewelry. And as I mentioned earlier, my limited liability company specifically specializes in anonymously acquiring these exact types of distressed assets. I slid the paperwork closer to her, forcing her to read the bold signature line at the very bottom of the page. "I bought your defaulted mortgage yesterday morning, Mom. I paid in full cash. I am your new bank." The reality of what I had just said hung in the air like a massive physical weight pressing down on the entire room. I watched my mother stare at the notice of default, and I could see her mind desperately trying to find a way out of this trap. For her entire life, Brenda had been able to charm, manipulate, or bully her way out of every negative consequence. She truly believed that she was playing a game where she made all the rules and controlled all the players. But the financial world does not operate on country club gossip or fake tears. It operates on legally binding contracts and absolute mathematical certainties. By defaulting on a massive high-interest second mortgage, my mother had essentially handed the keys to her pristine 4-bedroom colonial house directly to the bank. And because my limited liability company had swept in and purchased that exact distressed asset from the lending institution, I was now the sole legal owner of the very roof over her head. I was her bank, I was her landlord, and I was the one holding the absolute power to decide her immediate future. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a second document. This one was enclosed in a stiff legal envelope with a bright red certified mail sticker attached to the front. The sound of the thick paper sliding against the polished wood of the head table was deafening in the silent ballroom. 300 guests were watching this slow-motion train wreck unfold, and nobody dared to make a single sound. Even the catering staff had stopped pouring wine and were standing completely still against the back wall. Kendra was sitting frozen in her beautiful white wedding gown, her dark eyes tracking every single movement I made. She was watching a masterclass in accountability, and I wanted her to see exactly what happened when this family was forced to face the truth. I pushed the heavy envelope directly across the crisp white tablecloth until it bumped gently against my mother's crystal water glass. Mom, you have always cared so deeply about appearances. I said, my voice steady and clear, projecting effortlessly across the vast room. You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars maintaining a perfectly manicured lawn and hosting lavish dinner parties just so your friends would think you were wealthy. You threw away my future to protect the illusion of Jason's incredible success. But illusions are fragile things, and they always shatter when they hit the real world. Tonight, the grand illusion is officially over. That envelope contains a formal notice to vacate. Because you are in severe financial default, and I am the new legal owner of the mortgage, I am officially foreclosing on the property. My legal team filed the necessary paperwork with the county court yesterday afternoon. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your expensive clothes, your designer furniture, and your precious social status. After 30 days, the local sheriff will arrive at the property to change the locks and physically remove you from the premises. The words hit the table like a bomb. A notice to vacate, an eviction. In the ultra-wealthy circles of our suburban hometown, being foreclosed upon and evicted by the local sheriff was the ultimate permanent social death sentence. It was a massive scandal that people would whisper about for decades at dinner parties and charity galas. Brenda stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike her. She did not touch it. Her face had lost all of its natural color, turning a sickening shade of pale gray. Her perfectly styled hair suddenly looked incredibly heavy, and her expensive silk dress looked like a cheap costume she had stolen. The grand facade of the perfect, wealthy matriarch was completely destroyed right in front of the very people she desperately wanted to impress. I looked out at the tables closest to the front of the ballroom. These were the tables exclusively reserved for Brenda's most important country club friends. The women she played tennis with every Tuesday morning, the wives of local politicians and wealthy corporate executives who had spent the last 20 years drinking expensive mimosas in our backyard. They were all staring at my mother with expressions of absolute horror and profound disgust. They were not disgusted by me serving the legal papers. They were disgusted by her. In their shallow and judgmental world, financial failure was treated like a highly contagious disease. I watched as two of her closest friends leaned away from the head table, whispering furiously to their husbands. One of them picked up her designer purse and subtly began inching her chair backward, preparing to leave the reception early. They were abandoning her in real time. Brenda's entire social universe was actively collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Jason was hyperventilating. His chest was heaving up and down as he stared in absolute horror at the eviction notice resting on the table. The fake technology chief executive officer suddenly realized that his safety net had just been completely incinerated. He had planned to move back into that beautiful colonial house with Kendra while he supposedly worked on his groundbreaking software company. He had planned to keep living off our mother's stolen money while comfortably sleeping in his childhood bedroom. But that house was gone. "Mom, what is she talking about?" Jason yelled, his voice cracking with panic and desperation. "You cannot let her take the house. Where are we supposed to go? I do not have an apartment anymore. I gave up my lease because you said Kendra and I could live with you while the corporate buyout went through. We are going to be homeless." Kendra closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. She had just discovered that her new husband was not only a complete fraud and a federal thief, but he was also entirely dependent on his mother for a basic place to sleep. The man she thought she was marrying did not exist. Jason was nothing more than a terrified little boy hiding behind a stolen luxury watch and a leased vehicle. Brenda finally broke. The arrogant, cruel woman who had smiled and whispered that I would never last at Harvard was completely gone. Her shoulders slumped forward and she collapsed heavily against the edge of the table. She reached out with trembling hands and tightly grabbed my wrist. She looked up at me, and the heavy tears streaming down her face were finally genuine. They were not tears of remorse for what she had done to me. They were tears of absolute terror for herself. "Samantha, please." Brenda sobbed, her voice weak and pathetic. "Please do not do this to me. I will lose everything. My friends will never speak to me again. I will be completely ruined in this town. You cannot throw your own mother out onto the street. We are family, Samantha. We are your family. You have to forgive me. I am your mother. You have to help us right now. Family is always the very last word toxic people use when they have completely run out of leverage. When their lies have been exposed and their control has been shattered, they suddenly want to talk about the unbreakable bond of family. I stood at the head table and looked down at my mother. Brenda was sobbing openly now. Her tears were smudging her expensive makeup, and she was begging me to show her the kind of grace she had never once shown me. She wanted me to remember that she was my mother. She wanted me to forget the financial fraud, the lies, and the cruel way she had treated me my entire life just because we shared the same blood. But blood does not make a family. Actions make a family. And my mother's actions had severed our family ties a very long time ago. Mom, I want you to stop crying for just 1 minute and listen to me, I said, my voice dropping to a very quiet but incredibly firm volume. The entire ballroom leaned in to hear my words. You are begging me not to throw you out onto the street. You are crying because you are terrified of losing your comfortable bed and your beautiful home. But I want you to think back to exactly 15 years ago. I want you to remember what you did to me the week after I turned 18. Because I remember it perfectly. I remember standing in the freezing cold outside the downtown Greyhound bus station. It was the middle of January, and it was raining. I was shivering in a cheap jacket holding 2 worn-out duffel bags that contained every single thing I owned in the entire world. You had just told me that because I was not going to a prestigious Ivy League university, I was no longer welcome to live under your roof. You told me that I was a disappointment and that I needed to figure out my own life. I remember looking at you as you sat in the driver's seat of your warm luxury sport utility vehicle. You did not even step out into the rain to say goodbye to me. You just rolled down the window, shoved a single $50 bill into my freezing hand, and told me to buy a ticket to wherever the state college was located. $50, Mom. That was the total value you placed on my life as you drove away and left me completely alone in a dangerous part of the city at 18 years old. I cried that day. I begged you not to leave me just like you are begging me right now, but you just rolled up your tinted window and drove back to your perfect suburban house. And do you know what the most painful part of that memory is? I continued refusing to let her look away from me. It is not the freezing rain, or the fact that I had to sleep on the floor of a bus terminal. The most painful part is knowing exactly what you did the very next morning. While I was riding a filthy bus across the state, you were driving Jason to the international airport. You bought him a first-class ticket to Europe. You paid for him to take a year-long gap year so he could travel across Italy and France to find himself. You drained my college trust fund to finance his luxury vacations, while you left me at a bus stop with a single $50 bill. So please do not sit here in your expensive silk dress and talk to me about family. You do not know the true meaning of the word. Brenda let out a wailing sob and buried her face in her hands. She had absolutely no defense. I had just dismantled her final emotional manipulation tactic using her own horrific actions. The country club friends sitting at the front tables were visibly appalled. Leaving an 18-year-old girl at a bus station in the rain was not just bad parenting, it was completely heartless. Any remaining shred of sympathy they might have had for her completely vanished into thin air. I stood tall, feeling a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I was no longer the frightened teenager standing in the rain. I was the owner of this ground she was currently crying on. I am not going to forgive you, Mom, I stated with absolute finality. I am not going to give you an extension, and I am not going to let you stay in my house. You have 30 days to vacate the property. If you leave any of your garbage behind, I will have it thrown into a dumpster. Jason realized in that exact moment that I was an absolute brick wall. He saw that our mother had completely failed to manipulate me and that his entire free ride was officially over. The fake tech genius was about to be homeless and broke. Panic completely took over his mind. He spun around wildly looking for any possible lifeline to save him from the consequences of his own actions. His eyes frantically darted across the head table until they finally landed on the beautiful woman sitting right next to him. He turned his entire body toward Kendra. His bride had been sitting in complete silence watching my family self-destruct with a cold, analytical gaze. Jason reached out his sweaty hands and forcefully grabbed her forearms. He fell to his knees right there on the pristine floor of the grand ballroom, ruining his expensive custom-tailored tuxedo pants. He looked up at her with wide, desperate eyes, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his pride. He was no longer trying to look like a successful billionaire. He was just a terrified fraud, begging to be rescued. "Kendra, baby, please." Jason pleaded, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room. "You have to save us. You are my wife. You make so much money at the hospital. You have to pay off her house right now. You promised to love me for better or for worse. We are a team. Please do not let my sister do this." Jason was still on his knees on the polished hardwood floor of the grand ballroom. The perfectly tailored fabric of his expensive tuxedo pants was ruined, but he did not care about his appearance anymore. His fake billionaire persona had been stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified, desperate man. He was gripping Kendra's forearms so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. The room was watching him. The same country club guests who had been toasting his massive success an hour ago were now staring at him with a mixture of pity and intense second-hand embarrassment. Uncle Rick was leaning against the wooden bar, quietly sipping his drink and watching the golden boy unravel. Jason looked up at his beautiful bride with heavy tears streaming down his face. He had spent the last 2 years convincing Kendra that he was an equal partner in their relationship. He had promised her a wonderful life of luxury and endless financial security. But now the absolute truth was finally out. He was completely broke. He had no company and no real assets. And his mother was about to be evicted from the only home he had ever known. "Kendra, please, you have to listen to me right now." Jason begged, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. "You are the only person who can fix this massive mess. You are a top-tier anesthesiologist. I know exactly how much money you make at the hospital every month. I have seen your private bank statements. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in your savings account right now. You can write a large check to pay off the defaulted second mortgage today. You can buy the house back from Samantha. We can let Mom stay there and we can still move into the master bedroom just like we originally planned. It will be a solid real estate investment for our future financial portfolio. You always said you wanted to own a large colonial house in the suburbs. This is our perfect chance to get one. I will keep working on my software company in the basement office. I just need a little more time to secure real venture capital funding. Once the corporate acquisition goes through, I promise I will pay you back every single penny with interest. You just have to float the family finances for a year or two until my tech empire finally takes off." I stood at the head table and watched my brother actively try to infect Kendra with his financial cancer. He was using the exact same toxic manipulation tactics our mother had used on him for his entire life. He was trying to make Kendra feel completely responsible for his own catastrophic failures. "Baby, you have to understand that I only lied because I wanted to be a perfect husband." Jason pleaded frantically, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. "I wanted to deeply impress you. I wanted to give you the beautiful wedding you always dreamed about. None of this is actually my fault. Samantha is trying to destroy us because she is a highly bitter person. But we cannot let her win this fight. We stood at the altar earlier today, and we made a sacred promise in front of God and all of our friends. We promised to stay together for richer or for poorer. We are a solid team, Kendra. We are officially husband and wife. We are legally bound to each other now. What belongs to you belongs to me too. We are married now, and your money is our money. We have to protect our family from my sister." The phrase, "your money is our money," hung heavily in the silent air of the grand ballroom. It was the absolute worst thing Jason could have possibly said in that exact moment. Kendra was a fiercely independent woman who had fought incredibly hard for everything she had. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood and took out massive student loans to get through a difficult medical school. She worked grueling 80-hour weeks during her hospital residency, surviving on cheap coffee and sheer willpower. She built her incredible career and her substantial savings account through years of intense sacrifice and total dedication. She had paid for her half of this lavish wedding reception entirely in cash. She had entered into this romantic relationship genuinely believing she was partnering with an ambitious and driven equal. Hearing the arrogant man she had just married openly demand immediate access to her hard-earned salary to bail out his criminal mother was the final breaking point. Jason was not asking for a temporary financial loan. He was demanding a permanent financial host. He saw Kendra not as a beloved wife, but as a convenient human bank account designed to fund his ongoing delusions of grandeur. Kendra did not say a single word. She did not yell or burst into tears. She looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the floor in front of her. Her dark eyes were devoid of warmth, sympathy, or affection. The look on her face was one of absolute disgust. It was the kind of look you give to a cockroach that has scurried across a kitchen counter. She pulled her arms back, forcing Jason to release his desperate hold on her wrists. She took a deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between herself and the toxic mess of my family. The guests in the ballroom held their breath, waiting to see what the doctor would do next. Kendra raised her left hand, holding it up so the chandelier light caught the sparkling stone on her ring finger. She stared coldly at the expensive jewelry that had been paid for with my stolen tuition money. Without breaking eye contact with Jason, she reached over with her right hand. She pinched the sides of the large diamond and slowly began to twist the engagement ring off her finger. Kendra stood perfectly straight, looking down at the man who was still kneeling on the hardwood floor. The glittering stone on her left hand caught the bright light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. When Jason proposed to her 6 months ago, he made a massive spectacle out of the event. He loudly bragged to her friends that he spent $30,000 on a flawless 3-carat diamond. He claimed it was a symbol of his immense success and his eternal devotion to her. But as Kendra pinched the cold metal band between her fingers, there was absolutely no love left in her eyes. She twisted the ring past her knuckle. Jason watched her movements in absolute horror. He reached his hands up trying to stop her, but she easily swerved out of his grasp. She held the sparkling piece of jewelry in the air suspended between her thumb and index finger. The ballroom was completely silent, watching the final destruction of Jason's carefully crafted billionaire persona. Without breaking eye contact with the terrified man kneeling in front of her, Kendra slowly extended her arm over the pristine white tablecloth. She positioned her hand directly above Jason's half-full crystal champagne glass, and then she simply let go. The ring fell through the air and hit the pale yellow liquid with a sharp, distinctive plink. It sank straight to the bottom of the expensive crystal flute, resting quietly among the rising bubbles. It was a gesture of absolute finality and complete disrespect. Jason let out a strangled gasp. He scrambled up from his knees, knocking his chair backward in the process. "What are you doing?" Jason yelled, reaching frantically toward the glass. "Are you completely insane, Kendra? That is a $30,000 custom diamond ring. You cannot just drop it into a glass of champagne. You are acting completely irrational right now." Kendra did not look irrational. She looked like a woman who had just solved a highly complex puzzle. She reached over and picked up a clean linen napkin, calmly wiping a small drop of condensation from her hand. "It is not a $30,000 custom diamond, Jason," Kendra stated, her voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "It is a very cheap piece of moissanite set in a standard commercial sterling silver band." The guests at the nearby tables gasped loudly. Jason froze, completely paralyzed by her words. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. "I am a medical professional, Jason." Kendra continued, her tone completely steady and educational. "I work with highly precise instruments every single day. I do not leave things to chance. 3 weeks ago, I took the ring to an independent master jeweler downtown because I wanted to have it properly insured before we traveled for our honeymoon. The jeweler took one look at the stone through his specialized magnifying loupe and he actually laughed out loud. He told me the entire piece of jewelry was worth maybe $400 on a good day. Jason opened his mouth to argue, but Kendra immediately cut him off. "Do not try to tell me the jeweler was wrong, Jason." Kendra commanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Do not try to gaslight me in front of all these people." When the jeweler told me the ring was a cheap fake, a very disturbing puzzle finally began to piece itself together in my mind. I started looking back at all of your behaviors over the last 2 years. I remembered how you always insisted on paying for dinners with your corporate credit card, but the card was mysteriously declined at least 3 times. I remembered how you claimed you were working late at the office, but you never actually smelled like you had been in a professional building. I knew something was fundamentally wrong with your story. I knew you were hiding a massive financial secret from me. I just did not have the hard evidence to prove it until your sister projected the forensic audit onto that wall tonight. Kendra turned her head slightly and looked directly at me. I gave her a small, acknowledging nod. She looked back at Jason, who was still staring at the cheap ring sitting at the bottom of the champagne glass. "Samantha's documents did not ruin our relationship, Jason," Kendra said, her voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper. "Her documents merely provided the final, undeniable proof of what I already suspected in my gut. You are a complete fraud. You built our entire relationship on a foundation of stolen money and cheap illusions. You lied to me about your career. You lied to me about your finances. You lied to me about the very ring you used to ask me to spend the rest of my life with you. I thought I was marrying a partner, but I was just marrying a parasitic con artist looking to fund his pathetic lifestyle." Kendra reached down and picked up her white silk clutch from the table. She turned her back on Jason, preparing to walk away from the head table. The absolute rejection was too much for Jason's fragile, narcissistic ego to handle. He realized that his beautiful, successful bride was walking out the door, taking her massive medical salary and his only chance at survival with her. Jason lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the white tablecloth and pulling it hard enough to send several crystal plates crashing to the hardwood floor. "You absolutely cannot leave me!" Jason screamed loudly, his panicked voice echoing wildly across the massive dining room. His face was twisted into a mask of pure desperation and rage. "You cannot just walk away from me, Kendra. We are officially married. We stood at the altar 2 hours ago. We took sacred vows in front of a Catholic priest and all of our family. You made a promise to God. You are legally and completely bound to me for the rest of your life." Jason was screaming about sacred vows and Catholic priests. He thought he had her trapped. In his narcissistic mind, he believed that because she had worn the white dress, he now owned a legal stake in her entire financial future. He pointed a sweaty finger at Kendra, demanding she uphold her end of the contract. "You cannot just walk away from me," Jason bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. "We are in a community property state, Kendra. We are married. If you walk out that door right now, I will take half of everything you own. I will drag you through a messy divorce court for years. You will pay me alimony. You are my wife, and you owe me everything." Kendra simply stood there, letting his desperate threats wash over her. She looked like a brilliant professional woman who was exactly 10 steps ahead of the pathetic man throwing a tantrum on the floor. She looked down at Jason and delivered a masterclass in legal self-defense. "You really do not know anything about me, Jason, do you?" Kendra said, her voice perfectly calm and steady. "You saw a successful doctor with a high salary and you saw a free ride. But you completely underestimated my intelligence. I did not survive medical school and build a massive savings account by being foolish with my future. I grew up watching hardworking women in my neighborhood lose everything to men exactly like you. Men who talk big but contribute absolutely nothing to the household. I promised myself a very long time ago that I would never let anyone take what I worked so hard to build." Jason looked confused. He was desperately trying to cling to the illusion of his marital rights. "What are you talking about?" Jason stammered, blinking rapidly as sweat rolled down his face. We said our vows. The priest pronounced us husband and wife. The church recognized it. You are legally bound to me, Kendra. Kendra let out a soft, humorless laugh. She shook her head, looking at him with an expression of pure pity. Jason, a church ceremony is a beautiful spiritual event. Kendra explained, speaking to him as if he were a slow child. It is a lovely tradition with beautiful flowers and pretty words. But a religious priest does not determine legal asset division in the United States. The state government determines that. And the state only recognizes a legal marriage when a very specific document is properly signed, officially witnessed, and filed directly with the county clerk. The realization slowly began to dawn on Jason. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a ruined tuxedo. Before we walked down the aisle today, I had a long meeting with my personal attorney. Kendra continued, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. My lawyer is an incredibly smart man. He told me that entering into a legally binding financial contract with a man who constantly refused to show me his actual corporate tax returns was a massive risk. He strongly advised me to protect my personal assets just in case your imaginary tech empire turned out to be a complete fabrication built on stolen family money. Jason tried to stand up, but his legs were shaking too badly. He slumped heavily back against the edge of the head table, gasping for air. Exactly what did you do, Kendra? Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. I followed my personal lawyer's direct advice, Kendra replied, looking right at him. I told the wedding coordinator that I was far too emotional and nervous to deal with legal paperwork before the ceremony. I asked them to leave the official marriage license upstairs in the secure bridal suite. I told everyone we would sign it privately after the reception was over, which means, Jason, that the incredibly important piece of paper required to make this marriage legal is currently sitting on a desk 3 floors above us, completely blank. My signature is not on it. Your signature is not on it. The witnesses have not signed it. The ballroom erupted into a chorus of shocked whispers. Kendra had completely outsmarted the con artist. She had built an ironclad escape hatch right into her own wedding day. She looked at Jason and delivered the most satisfying blow of the entire evening. We are not married, Jason, Kendra stated with absolute finality. You do not have a wife, you do not have a partner, and you most certainly do not have access to a single penny of my money. We are not in a community property marriage because there is no marriage. You are legally entitled to absolutely nothing. I do not owe you alimony. I do not owe you a divorce. I do not owe you a single conversation ever again. As soon as I walk out of those heavy oak doors, our relationship is completely and legally erased. Kendra turned her back on him completely. She began to walk away from the head table, moving with the incredible grace and power of a woman who had just saved her own life. She was leaving him alone with his crimes and his poverty. The sheer reality of losing everything broke whatever fragile sanity Jason had left. His wealthy meal ticket was finally walking away. His entire fake billionaire future was evaporating right into thin air. He just let out a loud, primal, desperate scream. Without thinking about the consequences, Jason lunged forward, pushing away from the table with violent force. He reached out aggressively, his hands curling into tight fists, aiming directly for the delicate silk of Kendra's wedding gown. He intended to physically grab her, to forcefully make her stay and listen to his pathetic lies. But Jason had completely forgotten that Kendra was definitely not alone in that massive ballroom, and his sudden aggressive physical movement instantly triggered the ultimate protective response from the bride's side of the entire family. Jason moved with a sudden, violent desperation that shocked the entire room. He lunged away from the head table, reaching his hands out to grab the delicate silk of Kendra's custom wedding gown. He wanted to physically force her to stay and listen to his pathetic lies. But Jason made a massive miscalculation about Kendra's family. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of her dress, a massive, solid wall of muscle suddenly materialized directly between them. Kendra's two older brothers, Jamal and Terrence, had been sitting at the family table closest to the stage. Both of them were former college football linebackers who still maintained their intense athletic training. They had watched my brother desperately try to manipulate their little sister. When Jason lunged, they moved with terrifying speed. Jamal stepped firmly in front of Kendra, crossing his massive arms over his broad chest. Terrence placed a heavy hand directly flat on Jason's shoulder and shoved him backward with enough force to send my brother stumbling into a stack of empty chairs. Jason crashed to the floor, completely humiliated and outmatched. "Do not even think about taking another single step toward her," Jamal warned, his deep voice booming across the silent ballroom. "You are done talking to my sister. If you try to touch her again, you will not be walking out of this hotel tonight, I swear it." Jason scrambled backward, terrified of the two imposing men standing over him. He curled into a pathetic ball on the floor, completely defeated. Kendra did not even flinch. She walked gracefully around the chaos, stepping up to the small wooden podium where Uncle Rick had delivered his toast earlier. She picked up the microphone. A sharp squeal of feedback echoed through the speakers. Kendra tapped the metal grill twice, ensuring she had the absolute attention of every single person remaining. "To my beautiful family and my wonderful friends," Kendra began, her voice radiating absolute strength. "I want to thank you all for traveling here to celebrate with me today. You have always supported my dreams and my medical career, and I love you for it. But as you have all just witnessed, the man sitting on the floor is not the successful entrepreneur he claimed to be. He is a financial fraud who stole money from his own sister to buy his way into my life. Because of my incredible lawyer, the marriage documents remain completely unsigned. There is absolutely no legal marriage. This wedding is officially canceled." A massive, loud wave of supportive cheers and applause erupted from Kendra's side of the ballroom. Her loving family was not embarrassed by the sudden cancellation. They were fiercely protective and incredibly proud of her for standing up to a toxic con artist. Kendra smiled, a beautiful, genuine, radiant smile that lit up the entire large room. "I refuse to let this family ruin our evening." Kendra continued, speaking directly to her cheering relatives. "We are not going to waste our energy mourning a relationship built on lies. Instead, we are going to celebrate the fact that I just dodged a massive bullet. There is a beautiful luxury rooftop bar located exactly 1 block across the street. I am officially inviting my side of the family and all of my friends to join me there right now. We are going to celebrate my financial independence. And do not worry about the bill because it is on my tab." The response was instantaneous and electric. Half of the massive ballroom immediately stood up from their tables. Kendra's aunts, uncles, cousins, and medical school colleagues grabbed their expensive coats and purses. They abandoned the Grand Plaza Hotel without a single second of hesitation, marching past the head table in a massive coordinated exodus of joy and relief. Terrence and Jamal flanked their sister, safely escorting the beautiful bride out of the grand wooden doors to celebrate her freedom. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. The contrast between the two sides of the room was visually stunning. Kendra's side was completely empty, leaving behind nothing but discarded napkins. My mother's side was sparsely populated by terrified country club members, awkwardly staring at their laps. The grand illusion of the perfect, wealthy wedding had been entirely hollowed out. Brenda, however, was fundamentally incapable of accepting absolute defeat. Even as her entire world burned to the ground, she desperately tried to salvage the optics for her remaining friends. She stood up from the head table, smoothing out her expensive silk dress and forcing a terrifyingly rigid smile onto her face. She picked up her crystal champagne flute and turned to the stunned women. "Well, I suppose it is for the best," Brenda announced, her voice shaking uncontrollably, despite her desperate attempts to sound completely casual in front of her peers. We all knew she was never truly a good fit for Jason anyway. She was far too focused on her hospital career to be a proper traditional wife for my son. We will simply return the wedding gifts and Jason will find someone much more suitable for his lifestyle. Now please, everyone, let us enjoy the catering." The chef worked so hard. Nobody moved to eat the food. Nobody raised a glass to toast her pathetic attempt at saving face. They stared at her, realizing she was completely detached from reality. I watched my mother try to build a new wall of lies over the smoking ruins of her old one. She was trying to pretend that the federal wire fraud and the impending house foreclosure simply did not exist. I could not let her escape into her delusions today. The accountability had to be absolute and entirely public. I reached down into my leather tote bag one final time. I pulled out a single crisp document printed on heavy government paper. I looked at Brenda and prepared to deliver the final, devastating blow of this entire terrible evening. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut behind Kendra and her family. The echoing thud left a suffocating silence in its wake. Half of the room was completely empty, with only crumpled napkins and champagne glasses remaining. My mother's wealthy country club friends sat frozen in their chairs, staring at Brenda with profound horror. Brenda was desperately trying to force a smile onto her pale face. She had just told everyone to ignore the massive family implosion and enjoy the catering. She was attempting to build a wall of denial right over the ruins of her life. She actually believed that if she smiled hard enough, everyone would forget I exposed her as a thief. But I was not going to let her escape into her delusions tonight. The accountability had to be absolute and public. I reached down into my leather tote bag one final time. My hand brushed past the bank statements until my fingers found a single crisp document printed on heavy government paper. I pulled it out and held it up. The chandeliers caught the official notary seal stamped at the bottom. "Mom, I want you to stop pretending," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "Do not tell your friends to eat the food. Do not try to sweep this federal crime under the rug. You need to sit down and listen to exactly what happens next. Because the eviction notice and the country club takeover are just civil consequences. The document I am holding represents the criminal consequences." Brenda stopped pouring champagne. The crystal bottle slipped from her shaking hands and clattered loudly against the wooden table, spilling expensive liquor across the white cloth. She stared at the paper in my hand with sheer terror. "You see, Mom, when my accounting team first audited the trust fund, we found a massive discrepancy," I explained, keeping my tone completely clinical. "We knew you wired the $200,000 to Jason, but to legally move that money out of a restricted educational trust fund, you needed an official dissolution document. You needed a piece of paper proving the creator of the trust had authorized the liquidation of the assets. My grandmother passed away 4 years ago," I continued, "but the trust dissolution paperwork was filed with the bank only 2 years ago. The dates simply did not match up. So my team pulled the original legal filing from the county archives and brought in a handwriting analyst to examine the signatures. The analyst did not even need a full hour to reach a definitive conclusion. You did not just break your fiduciary duty, Mom. You deliberately forged grandmother's signature on a binding federal banking document so you could illegally liquidate my college fund." The remaining guests gasped. Forgery was not just a mistake, it was a calculated, malicious felony. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving up and down in rapid breaths. Jason, who was still sitting on the floor, buried his face in his hands and began to sob loudly. He finally realized that our mother was not just going to lose her house, she was going to prison. "I know exactly what you are thinking, Mom," I said, watching her eyes dart nervously toward the exit. "You are sitting there calculating the timeline. You are trying to remember the legal rules about prosecuting old crimes. You think that because you forged the signature 2 years ago, you might be safe. You think there is a statute of limitations that will protect you from going to jail. But you are completely wrong. When a normal person commits a financial crime, the state usually has a limited number of years to prosecute them," I stated clearly. "But you were not a normal person in this specific situation. You were the legally appointed trustee. You held a strict fiduciary duty to me. And under the law, when a fiduciary actively conceals their financial fraud, the statute of limitations is completely thrown out the window. There is absolutely no expiration date on the crimes you committed against me. The state can prosecute you today, tomorrow, or 10 years from now. I placed the heavy government document directly on top of the spilled champagne. Yesterday morning, after I purchased the mortgage on your house, I had my corporate legal team compile a physical binder. I said, my voice dropping to a cold, unforgiving whisper. The binder contained the forged trust dissolution paperwork, the bank wire transfers, and the complete forensic audit of Jason's fake software company. We did not send that binder to your personal lawyer, Mom. We sent it directly to the state prosecutor downtown. The final anvil had officially been dropped. The state prosecutor was already reviewing the evidence of her felony crimes. Warrants would be issued. Investigators would be knocking on the door of the house she no longer owned. She would be publicly arrested and dragged into a courtroom in front of the news cameras. Her suburban life was entirely over. Brenda let out an agonizing sound that was halfway between a scream and a choke. Her knees finally gave out. She collapsed heavily into her dining chair. She stared blankly ahead, completely catatonic. She had lost her wealth, her home, her country club status, and her freedom all in a single hour. Jason continued to weep on the floor, totally paralyzed by his own failures. I did not feel sorry for either of them. I had spent 10 years carrying the heavy burden of their lies, and today I was finally setting it down. I walked back to my chair. I unplugged the adapter cable from the projection system. The financial audit disappeared from the white wall. I carefully placed the tablet back into my leather tote bag. I gathered up my legal folders. I zipped the bag closed with a sharp final sound. My work here was finished. I looked at my mother sitting completely paralyzed in her chair. The heavy government document resting on the spilled champagne was the final nail in the coffin of her grand illusion. I did not scream at her. I did not stand over her and gloat about my victory. For 10 long years I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of her betrayal. I had spent countless nights wondering why I was not good enough for her love. But looking at her now, reduced to a trembling shell of a woman, terrified of the legal consequences of her own actions, I felt absolutely nothing. The anger that had fueled my 20s was completely gone. In its place was a profound sense of peace. I had reclaimed my stolen power, and I had exposed the truth to the entire world. There was nothing left to say. Jason was still curled up on the floor, weeping like a lost child. He did not look like a tech visionary. He did not look like a chief executive officer. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a fraud who had finally run out of lies. I slowly turned my back on both of them. I reached down and picked up my leather tote bag, ensuring my tablet and my legal folders were securely inside. I zipped the bag closed. The sharp metallic sound of the zipper echoed loudly in the massive, silent ballroom. I walked away from the head table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I did not look back. As I made my way toward the grand exit, I noticed the catering staff standing nervously near the kitchen doors. They had witnessed the entire massive family implosion. They had watched the bride leave and half the guests abandon the reception. Now they were left to clean up the physical mess of a canceled wedding. I knew exactly how hard they worked because I used to work those exact same grueling service jobs to pay off the student loans my mother forced me to take. I stopped walking and approached the head banquet manager. He was a kind-looking older man who seemed incredibly stressed about the chaotic situation. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, crisp bank envelope. I had brought it with me specifically for this purpose. I handed the heavy envelope directly to him. There is $5,000 in cash inside that envelope. I said, my voice warm and respectful. Please divide it equally among your entire staff tonight. You all did an absolutely beautiful job with the food and the service, and I am so incredibly sorry that your evening was completely derailed by my family drama. The banquet manager opened the envelope and his eyes went wide with shock. He looked up at me, completely speechless. Thank you so much, Mom, he finally stammered. I smiled at him. No, thank you for your hard work, I replied. Please tell the staff they can start clearing the tables whenever they are ready. The party is officially over. I turned away from the kitchen doors and continued my walk toward the main exit. As I neared the heavy oak doors, I saw Uncle Rick leaning against the grand mahogany bar. He was the one who had started this entire chain reaction with his drunken toast. He was holding a fresh glass of bourbon, looking out over the empty ballroom with a faint smile on his face. He looked at me as I approached and raised his glass in a silent salute. "You always were the smartest person in this family, Samantha," Uncle Rick said, his voice slightly slurred but entirely sincere. "I am glad you finally gave them exactly what they deserved." I stopped and looked at my uncle. He was a deeply flawed man, but tonight his bitterness had inadvertently set me free. "Thank you for the toast, Uncle Rick," I replied softly. "Please have a safe ride home tonight. I will make sure the valet calls you a car." I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. The transition from the stifling tension of the ballroom to the crisp, quiet night was incredibly refreshing. I stood on the grand stone steps of the Oak Creek Country Club. The massive building stood behind me, bathed in warm, elegant lighting. It was my building now. I owned the very ground my mother and brother were currently crying on. But I did not want to stay there. I did not want to bask in the glory of my newly acquired real estate. I just wanted to go home and sleep peacefully for the first time in 10 years. I walked down the stone steps and handed my ticket to the valet. As I waited for my car, I looked up at the stars shining brightly in the clear night sky. The heavy burden of seeking my mother's approval was finally lifted from my shoulders. I had walked into that reception as the discarded scapegoat, and I was walking out as the undisputed architect of my own destiny. I had executed my plan with absolute icy grace, leaving my toxic family to choke on the ashes of their own deceit. They had stolen my college fund, but they had inadvertently given me the relentless drive to conquer the financial world. I climbed into my car and drove away from the country club, leaving the ruins of my family far behind me. I did not wait for an apology, because I knew a genuine apology would never come. And the beautiful truth was that I no longer needed one to be happy. The universe has a very funny way of balancing the scales. While I drove back to my peaceful life, the gears of justice were beginning to grind for Brenda and Jason, and the true extent of their karmic punishment would not fully reveal itself until several months later. 6 months have passed since the night of the canceled wedding. The swift and brutal reality of the legal system moved much faster than my family ever anticipated. True accountability always feels like a sudden, devastating earthquake to people who have spent their entire lives building fragile houses out of lies and manipulation. Today, the heavy dust has finally settled, and the landscape of our lives looks entirely different. I kept my absolute promise. Exactly 30 days after I handed my mother the formal eviction notice, the local county sheriff arrived at the beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house. Brenda stubbornly refused to pack her belongings, hoping I would magically change my mind at the very last minute. She was physically escorted off the property, while all of her wealthy neighbors stood on their perfectly manicured lawns and watched the massive spectacle. My holding company immediately renovated the large house and sold it for a massive profit. My mother now lives in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. She does not have a heated swimming pool or a grand dining room anymore. The state prosecutor offered her a strict plea deal regarding the federal wire fraud and the forged banking documents. To avoid spending the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary, Brenda pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges. She was sentenced to 5 years of strict probation and 1,000 hours of mandatory community service. The arrogant woman who used to brag about her exclusive Platinum Country Club membership now spends her weekends wearing a bright orange safety vest, picking up garbage along the side of the local highway. Her wealthy friends completely abandoned her. Her phone never rings, and her mailbox is entirely empty. Jason did not fare any better. Without his mother's stolen money to comfortably fund his fake billionaire lifestyle, his entire technology empire immediately evaporated into thin air. He had no proprietary code, no venture capital investors, and absolutely no marketable skills. He was quickly forced to move into a cheap roadside motel until his remaining cash finally ran out. Today, my 30-year-old brother, who proudly claimed he was on the verge of a multi-million-dollar software buyout, is working a minimum-wage retail job at a fading local shopping mall. He spends his long days folding cheap denim jeans and stocking dusty shelves under harsh fluorescent lights. He tried to contact Kendra for 3 straight months, begging her for a second chance and pathetically asking for financial loans. Kendra swiftly blocked his phone number, his email address, and every single one of his social media accounts. She legally secured her personal assets and erased him completely from her vibrant life. He is nothing more than a fading bad memory. As for me, I am currently sitting in a private corner booth at one of the most exclusive high-end restaurants in New York City. The crystal chandeliers above me are sparkling brightly, and the iconic city skyline glows beautifully outside the massive glass windows. But I am not sitting here alone. Across the table from me, holding a glass of vintage champagne, is Kendra. We did not just walk away from my toxic family that night. We walked away with a profound mutual respect for each other. Over the last 6 months, we bonded over our shared traumatic experience. We went from being complete strangers, caught in a terrible web of lies, to becoming incredibly close friends. We became the family we actively chose for ourselves. Kendra is thriving at her hospital, recently receiving a massive promotion to Chief of Anesthesiology. She looks absolutely radiant, free from the heavy emotional burden of supporting a parasitic fraud. We joyfully clink our crystal glasses together, celebrating our massive career success and our hard-won peace. Looking back on the last 10 years, I finally understand the greatest lesson of my entire life. My mother and brother truly thought that by denying me an Ivy League education, they could keep me permanently beneath them. They thought that by stealing my college fund, they were destroying my foundation. They believed that success was a highly limited resource and that my personal failure was absolutely necessary for their triumph. But they severely underestimated the incredible power of human resilience. They did not realize that forcing me to struggle was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. Working 80-hour weeks to pay off predatory student loans taught me relentless discipline. Tearing apart fraudulent companies taught me how to read the undeniable truth hidden inside complex financial numbers. They tried to bury me deep in the dirt, but they did not know I was a seed ready to grow. Looking back on everything that transpired, I realized that true family is never defined by a shared last name or genetic biology. It is defined by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the active choice to value one another unconditionally. Kendra and I proved that you can walk away from a toxic environment and build something much stronger from the broken pieces. We are living proof that you are never completely trapped by the circumstances of your childhood. You always have the absolute power to rewrite your own narrative and choose exactly who gets a seat at your table. Your past does not dictate your future. You are the sole author of your own brilliant destiny. Harvard would have been a beautiful experience. A prestigious diploma would have looked very nice hanging on my corporate office wall. But the fierce resilience required to build an empire from absolute scratch is a real education you simply cannot get inside a comfortable classroom. The ability to look at the people who destroyed you and legally dismantle their power without shedding a single tear is a skill that only comes from deep survival. I lost my biological family, but I gained the entire world. And I would not change a single chapter of my amazing story. The greatest lesson we can take away from this story is that our worth is never defined by the people who fail to appreciate us, even if those people are our own family members. When you grow up in a toxic environment, it is incredibly easy to internalize the rejection. You might start believing that you somehow deserve the unfair treatment, or that you are inherently less valuable than the golden child. But that is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep you small and easily controlled. True empowerment begins the exact moment you decide to stop seeking validation from those who are completely committed to misunderstanding you. Samantha demonstrated that the ultimate revenge is not found in screaming matches or bitter arguments. The most powerful form of retaliation is massive, undeniable success, combined with the absolute enforcement of your personal boundaries. She used the pain of her past as the fuel to build an unshakable empire. When her toxic family finally needed her, she did not owe them a single ounce of grace, because they had never invested any love into her foundation. You have the absolute right to cut off anyone who drains your energy, steals your peace, or disrespects your journey. Blood does not guarantee a permanent place in your life. If you have ever felt underestimated, betrayed, or cast aside by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want to hear your story. Let me know how you built your own empire in the comments section below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories of resilience and karmic justice. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that their past trauma does not dictate their future success. Keep building your beautiful life.